Doc Talk with Dr. Brandon. How are you today?
Fantastic, Jim.
So listen, I could see from the camera that we're both identically dressed. Thank you for coming over last night. We had a little slumber party.
I appreciate that. I'm glad I got to wear yours. I thank you very much.
We watched the football game, had a little popcorn.
That's what boys do.
Yeah. And I, of course, had a little tea afterwards. And I know that you're a pure water guy, so it's all good, right? So
your Philadelphia Eagles won, too.
What have you been up to lately? How's business?
Oh, man, Jim, I just love it. I love every day hearing we're changing lives. So this week I had a wonderful seminar we did in Chapel Hill, which has been a very good response. We just want to get to, our whole goal is, our mission statement off the bio is not pellets, it's education to make informed consent. It sounds a little nerdy, but the cornerstone of any ethical medicine is informed consent. And we take that at heart.
And you're going to Brazil next week, right?
I'm going to Brazil to speak at the, they call it the Endocrinology Congress. And I'm very honored. Last year, Dr. Glazer and Dr. Morgenthau spoke there, and they asked me to speak this year. Qualgen, our pellets supplier, is running part of the conference, and they're asking us to go down there. I'm going to talk about, if you looked at aging as a disease, would you slow it down? And the disease process we're going to talk about is diabetes, cardiovascular disease, not just typical menopause symptoms or low testosterone in men, but how it could actually revolutionize medicine. If we could make healthier people, we decrease healthcare costs tremendously. Dr. Mark Richard, his book says, Nobody Wants You Healthy. He recommends, he was actually one of Obama's White House physicians. He said in his book, probably about $1 trillion of healthcare could be decreased if people were optimized on hormones. And I want to make that point clearly because I've been doing it now for 13, 14 years. We see people, I had a great case 2 weeks ago. 63-year-old man. He's insulin-dependent diabetic, means he needs insulin to live. He has a pump. He has 50 units a day. Being on pills with us for 4 months, he needs 15 units a day. That's significant in amount of insulin he needs. The cost to that as well, plus what low sugar does to your body versus the high sugar. Less blindness, less dementia, less cardiovascular disease. By literally 4 months of this, he decreases need by 35 points.
It's impressive. It's amazing. We should talk more about that down the road and how that works. So today we're going to talk about fertility.
Yep.
We're going to cover female and male. And for those that are new, we have 15-minute segments. We welcome live questions, so please feel free to pop your questions in and we'll get them asked along the way. And of course, if it goes longer than 15 minutes per segment, I have the right to continue the conversation for as long as possible.
You're the boss.
So why don't we get going and we'll start with females.
Fantastic.
So obviously, we've been reading a lot lately about the lower fertility rates, throughout most first world countries and probably throughout the world in general. So kind of just walk us through what you've seen. I mean, you've been an OBGYN for 30 some odd years, and now you are the owner of Optimal Bio, and you treat a lot of patients now. But just from your research and everything else, kind of walk the audience through what, is that true? And what you've seen over the last 10 or 15 years.
It's very interesting. Fertility rate, the actual phrase is called fungability rate. It's a very small percentage of chance of being pregnant per cycle. When I was in school 35 years ago, it was roughly a woman under 35. It was roughly around 20% per month. 35 to say 39 is probably about 16, 15%, and it decreases with age, because the maturity of the egg slows down. That's a natural process. So rates are in that range. There's about a 4-day window where a woman is fertile. Very, very important to understand that for pregnancy purpose. I was not a specialist in infertility, but I did infertility, general infertility. The basic workup for that is you always there's 5 basic steps in that workup. The first step is, does the husband have semen? Okay, we'll go over that in males, but do they have semen? The next test is there's 4 tests in women you check for. This is if they're not getting pregnant. The first thing is, do they ovulate? And a progesterone level drawn on day 21 to 24, if it's above 3, it means they ovulated, but above 10 has a higher pregnancy rate. There's a thing called a postcoital test. You check to make sure the sperm and the vagina mucosa mix properly. And then one of the next tests is called the HSG, hysterosalpingogram, where you actually put dye into the woman to see if the tubes are open, the cavity is normal. And the last one is you do laparoscopy to look for endometriosis and scar tissue. That's the process of not getting pregnant. Another caveat is also make sure the thyroid is proper. A woman having a regular cycle is a great sign of health. Great sign of health. And so those are things you looked for. Now, knowing that, the actual rate, again, we talked before, the sperm has to penetrate exactly 64 degrees horizontal. So it's a very complex, it was, I think, a miraculous event. But the thing about it, Jim, is the rate of getting pregnant per month is decreasing. I believe part of it, I know part of it is more in the male part because male sperm is plummeting. We'll go over those numbers in a few minutes. But there is things that are affecting women. And the thing about it is these fake plastics in the environment, I believe, are probably the culprit for hyperestrogenemia. When people say they're estrogen dominant, that could be a problem. But how the body works, if you're ovulating and having a period, you cannot be estrogen dominant. But they still complain of moodiness or breast tenderness. I believe that's the xenoestrogens, the fake estrogens, the plastics, the atrazine, those things in the environment. But those things, when you have a higher estrogen environment, there is a less chance of actually a fertilization of the egg.
And how does one avoid those? Do we just go metal on everything?
I believe. I mean, you look at things. Certain metals are bad, right? Aluminum, mercury. Try to avoid those. But it's just part of my mind is like, what did we do? The problem is our ego gets in the way and say we're such great diagnostics. We're great doctors now. We pick more diseases up. No, we're picking more diseases up because they're there. 90% of the food we ate 100 years ago was not there. We didn't eat that kind of food. And 90% of the diseases aren't there. And again, fertility is such a complex issue. When you throw other variables into it, these plastics, these chemicals, you think about it. I'll give you an example how we know how chemicals work. There's a thing called a Paragard IUD. That IUD works with copper. So they put an IUD inside the woman's uterus. The copper inside there, what it does is it attacks the axiom or the body of the sperm so it can't penetrate. Well, that's a heavy metal. So these things are very interesting. So when you add more heavy metals, there's been over 80,000 new chemicals in the world market since World War II. And you don't know what's going to happen within the first 5-10 years. You got to see multiple generations. The example we use is thalidomide on babies was to help decrease miscarriages, we have complications of losing limbs, and DES was supposed to decrease miscarriage rate, which actually increased miscarriage rate and ectopic rates. Again, I think it's very important the chemicals we put in our body match our body identically. That makes a complete difference. The problem is these lower values are actually affecting the way the body works. I'll give you an example. A healthy woman in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, their testosterone level, which is a range of about 80% of people fell in that group, was roughly between, say, 70 and 250. That was where 80% fell. Now the average woman sits in between 3 and 40. Well, what does that do for fertility? What does that do for multiple things? We know that estradiol, when it comes from it's called the Graafian follicle of the egg, which is necessary for ovulation, that molecule cannot be made, estradiol, unless it has testosterone. It comes from testosterone. In fact, a young, healthy, ovulated woman has 50 times more testosterone. And now in IVF, some IVF protocols are actually adding testosterone to that. So I can't say one thing's doing it, Jim. It's a compounding effect. But we now know this even sad part. Pregnancy rates are decreasing. Now, once you're pregnant, miscarriage rates are increasing. So you have the joy of being pregnant, and then you lose the baby a few weeks later. So I always tell everybody, enjoy your pregnant. You know, God's in charge of this thing, but we got to take care of things we know. This full fluoride debate, we know that. We know Harvard paper came out. Fluoride is terrible for the brain. We know that. Iodine is great for the brain. There's things we could common sensely use, but it's really, the statistics are very clear on how infertility is going down.
So take your testosterone example of a few seconds ago. If, let's say you have a 30-year-old patient, female, that's coming in and her testosterone is at 20, for example. And then through treatment, our average testosterone might be what?
Well, for us, 180, 250.
All right. Well, then they have a better chance of getting pregnant then?
There's no papers on that per se, but in my head, great-grandmas were 200, 250 when they were babies, and they had a lot of babies. 1960, the average mom in America had 3.6 babies. Now it's 2.1, 2.4. We need 2.1 just to break even.
Right.
Okay. So so in an environment where the natural woman was roughly 180, 200, had 3.5 babies versus today's environment. I have no studies to show that, but it sure looks like it. And again, some protocols they're adding testosterone to it. Again, testosterone is the most active, abundant hormone in the human body, not the male, the human. And they're measured in measurements, nanograms per deciliter, which are 1,000 times bigger than picograms. So you look at the thing, you say, oh, my testosterone is 25, my estrogen is 40, my estrogen is more. But that value is 1,000 times different. And you brought the number 25, which is very interesting. Again, back to Dr. Richard's books. Historically, a man's considered low at 300. It's called extremely low. Low under 500. But today they call a man normal if she's between 250 and 900. So my thought was, and I didn't find a paper, he showed it to me. So what does a 300 in a man equal in a woman? About 25. What does 500 equal in a man equal in a woman? About 37. So in today's numbers, 25 to 37 is considered a high number. They're low historically. So that has to have a bearing on fertility. It has to.
Mm-hmm. Let's take some questions from the audience. How can irregular menstrual cycles indicate potential hormonal imbalances affecting fertility?
Great. Without knowing numbers, without knowing labs, if you're bleeding on a regular cycle, 28 to 32 days, you're ovulating. Because you cannot have a progesterone withdrawal without progesterone. And you cannot make progesterone unless you ovulate. So what happens is the first 2 weeks of a woman's cycle is called the proliferative phase. That's when the brain is telling the ovary, make testosterone, make estrogen. When estrogen hits roughly 200 to 600 picograms a deciliter, when it hits that number, then the FSH turns off, the LH is turned on. About 18 to 36 hours after the LH peak, that's what you can measure in the ovulation predictor kits that measures LH. Your egg's going to release from the egg, the graphene follicle, and now the egg's released, and now the ovary causes what's called a corpus luteum. It's a white body is what it's called. And that white body produces progesterone. If you're pregnant, it produces it for 63 days. If it doesn't, it turns off, and there's your cycle. The placenta kicks in at 63 days. So that being said, how do you know you're good? If you're having a period. Period. That's all that matters. Now, we do know, as I said before, if you're having regular periods and not getting pregnant, the key thing is you can be suboptimal. You have enough to bleed, but not enough to ovulate a good egg. That number is above 3 is you could bleed. Above 10 is a higher pregnancy rate.
Okay. What's the connection between thyroid health and female fertility?
Great. Above the antipituitary is called the hypothalamus. Is the releasing hormones that if they're not in perfect sync, the FSH has to be at a certain amplitude and frequency, and when change the LH, that changes the amplitude and frequency. If any of the anterior pituitary hormones are off, i.e. the thyroid is in there, that could throw off the cycle. So it could be hyper or hypothyroid could throw off the cycle. That's why one of the very first steps of looking for thyroid disease to see how a woman's cycle is. So if the thyroid is euthyroid or optimal, you should have a regular period.
So is it possible that a woman can have a regular cycle and still her thyroid could be off?
Yes.
Okay.
And that's good because if you find out where the cycle's off, the thyroid's so bad, that means it's really bad. It's been not bad for a long time. And there's things to make the thyroid optimize without medication: iodine, selenium, vitamin B's, vitamin C's, iron. These are very important for the thyroid to work functionally. But the big thing of that on iodine, on thyroid, the government recommends 120 micrograms of iodine, which is interesting because the thyroid gland gets saturated at 3 grams. There's another tissue in the body that really fights for iodine. It's breasts. When the breasts are preparing for making milk, they're competing. That's why most hypothyroid patients or thyroiditis happens in a postpartum state, which leads to a blues or depression. So they all tie together.
So if you're pregnant, is it okay to be on iodine supplements?
It's actually better to be on iodine. The paper came out about 6 months ago showing iodine 12.5 milligrams per day increases the baby's IQ on average 30 points. All right. So what happened in 1979, if you guys remember your periodic table from school, you have a thing called halogens. It goes from small to big. You have fluoride, chlorine, bromine, iodine, a statin, which is interesting. All of them are bad for our body except for iodine. Okay, I'll go over fluoride one day. We'll spend years on how Flint, Michigan got poison of fluoride. But so the fluoride is more affinity. So when you start to the problem is we ate 25 milligrams of iodine, which is 200 times higher than the iodine would win the battle. We didn't have fluoride in the water. Now fluoride came in the water. That's overtaking the iodine, and that led to it's interesting. In 79, they replaced it with bromine, and thyroid disease in American women increased 800%, men 300%.
Not to go off topic, but bromide obviously replaced iodine in most breads in this country.
100%.
And then I just read that they're mandating folic acid be put in breads, beginning in 2026.
Here's the problem.
Don't pregnant females need folate?
Folate. And here's the thing. Folate, your body absorbs vitamin B9, has to be methylated, and then your body could use it in the cycle for energy, which is crucially important. 44% of Americans have a defect called MHA-TFR, which you cannot synthesize a synthetic one. So that leads to hyperactivity. So picture a kid, a bowl of cereal in the morning, and he has that disease. He's going to be hyperactive. He's going to be not absorbing it. He can't sit still. That's what that does. More importantly, for the baby, for the neural tube, the brain, spine to develop, you need B9. You don't need the synthetic version of that. That's insane.
It's crazy.
I know. I think they're trying to help out, but the answer is when you fortify things, no, have the right food, and then the body can actually assimilate from the right raw products. Not these. And again, we know the data. We know that synthetic does not, folic acid does not absorb in 44% of Americans. Why put it in?
But they know this.
I know this. I'm not. I mean, you saw.
They just care about the 56%.
I don't know. You saw on Rogan a few months ago, Casey and Callie. You saw that the data. The data's not new now. It's been out there for years.
How does PCOS and endometriosis affect hormones and fertility?
Good. Two different things. Polycystic ovarian syndrome. Why does the cyst? What happens is in the proliferative phase of the cycle, the first 14 days, you want to make a cyst. That's an egg to get released to release. The problem is if the estrogen never gets high enough, the cyst cannot get big enough. So because you should have multiple different sizes of cysts. Those are the eggs from when the baby's in the womb. But the problem is when they can't release, they all stay at the same size, and they actually get in the periphery of the ovary. That's called polycystic ovarian. It actually is an ultrasound pattern to that. But we diagnosed it back before that in the 30s by called the Stein-Leventhal's way. It looks like a golf ball. It gets hard and gets very like a golf ball. And the theory was because the fibrous tissues are on there, it cannot release the egg. So when I was in training, so they started doing wedge biopsies, taking that out, hoping to ovulate. When I was in training, we're starting to laser it to open it up. Dr. Lobo, I don't know if he's the chairman at Columbia, but he was my professor at USC. He would call it hyperandrogenetic chronic anovulation. High androgens, okay, caused by high sugar. So it's a diabetes. It's a metabolic disease. It's not a structural hormone disease. High sugar leads to what's called androstenedione, which is a type of androgen that allows the egg not to ovulate, so the layer gets nice and thick. So that was the problem. So it's a hormone disease. That's why they started using metformin and things like that. In my practice, I started putting them on fasting diets and low carbohydrates, and they could ovulate from that. So it's a hormonal disease. Endometriosis is a high estrogen disease. We don't know what causes it. It's when the lining of the uterus grows in other places other than the uterus. It can go to the liver, the heart, the brain, everywhere. I believe it has to do a component with the synthetic xenoestrogens out there. That's what I believe.
Perfect timing.